Hello, everybody. Are you able to see me and hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect, perfect. So let's start. It's already 3 o'clock. So I'll stop the video and share the PPT. We will go through the same process at any moment of time. If there's a query, you can either put it on the chat or stop me, interrupt me, and so we start this new uh, new section on gender and diaspora. And as a part of this, these are the objectives that we are going to look at. We will go through in trying to understand why gender needs to be understood with respect to migration, significance of studying gender and demographic, crucial sectoral and occupational dynamics associated with migration and gender. There's a list of ILO provisions for gender equality, analyze challenges relating to gender migration data. So more often than not, and this is a common misunderstanding that men and women are equal. There are nuances associated with men and women, and then when migration comes into the picture, we will see how things change. So first and foremost, for the benefit of everybody, mostly people may know, but I've come across in my own experience a lot of people who do not understand the difference between gender and sex. So I thought a couple of slides on gender and sex makes a lot of clarity in terms of understanding. Sex is the preferred term when referring to biology, whereas gender is morely a construct referring to behavior, cultural, and psychological traits typically associated with biological sex. The sense of sex is a label, male or female, one assigned at birth based on factors like chromosomes, genitals, and hormones. And in fact, a lot of people use sex and gender interchangeably, but there is a difference. So, and once we understand this, then we understand why uh, understanding gender and migration is important. There are some people who feel their sex does not align with their gender and may identify as transgender or non binary. Gender is relational and simply refers to women or men, but to relationship between them have been, and inevitably, the notions of gender is rooted in culture. So when we show an advertisement which says boys do not cry or ladke nahi rote, you are associating a particular cultural construct with a particular gender. And but however, these are changeable over time and space, indicating that variations in gender conceptions can be found both within and between cultures. So we understand two gender. Uh, However, today there are multiple genders which are there, and a lot of people do not associate themselves with any gender. So if you go and Google, you can find out the various genders which are available. And in fact, gender analysis was not emphasized while studying migration patterns for long. One of the reasons was when people started, studying migrations, more often they looked at the migration patterns, and they looked at the fact that, again, there is this, easy way of saying that men and women are equal. So, they looked at how migrations are happening rather than the fact how migrations happen with for different genders in different ways and the consequences of that. Either deliberately ignored the participation of females or assumed that the implications of migration was similar. the implications are different, the experiences are different, the understanding of migration by different genders are different, and we will see as we go along. So this was a little bit about the background. Then gender is a major influential factor in all stages of international migration. The aspiration to move, the motivation of persons to move abroad, their migration pathways, choice of a destination, and settlement experience. So inevitably, people just don't pack up and go. There are reasons to remember, even when you look at the history of or the story of human history, inevitably the origins of modern human beings happened in Africa, and then they moved. That movement could be because of resources, that movement could be because of number of people had increased in a particular area. More often than not, people move because of certain conditions. In recent decades, gender-specific studies of migrations have discussed a feminization of migration, where female migrants move in. So there are, in fact, female corridors which have been earmarked, or people have seen that between, say, for example, Nepal, India, India, Nepal is a female corridor where there is a lot of movement of females. A greater number than ever before. So this is again a part of the globalization, economic globalization and connection. So there is a feminization of migration. A better understanding of migration experiences of women, men, and other gender groups. Again, one would typically, a basic question might come in a lot of people's thought process as to why do we need to understand all this? We need to understand all this because initially when there was no concept of states or nation states or boundaries, people would move about freely. Once nation states came in, the concept of democracy came in, the concept of welfare state came in. It was the responsibility of the state to look after people within the boundaries of the state. And then the concept of civilization brought in, and the welfare state brought in the concept that everybody should be taken care of. There should be nobody left behind. Of a double disadvantage for female migrants on account of their sex and migration status, more likely to face discrimination or mistreatment in comparison to male migrants. And more often than not, unless the state or the government of the particular state knows about, the breakup in terms of gender, how do they prepare themselves in terms of how to handle? Because, each gender would require a separate treatment. And also during irregular migration and asylum seeking situation, there is a pressing need for better protection and inequalities against gender-based violence. So, a very interesting example happened when the COVID lockdown happened. There was a whole lot of gender-related violence which happened because now the families were stuck in a particular place of residence. So initially, when there was abuse in a particular residence, because of movement, that abuse reduced. But now when people were confined to a single place, the incidence of abuse increase. So there are these inequalities, and the state needs to put in protection measures against gender-based violence, exploitations during migration, transitions, and settlement. And remember, migration also has a transition. How the migrants are moving from one place to other place, there's a transition process. What happens during the transition? Yes, Swadesh, you're right, from Andhra Pradesh to Gulf. In fact, from a lot of places now, women workers, that is what is called feminization of migration. Women workers are moving. In fact, we have a case study of Philippines where a lot of Filipino women are moving as, low skill workers, caregivers. We have a case study on that. So the need for gender-specific data, including a migration data, has been subject in a number of elements. And again, so this has been an important component in a lot of international conferences. And in fact, it came out of the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 set of goals. Idea is to eradicate inequality. Again, as I said, the story is about the human beings. And if human beings, there is an inequality which remains, then it becomes a moral dilemma for the humans in terms of a welfare state, in terms of providing amenities, aimed of ensuring that no one is left behind. That's the basic idea. And from that is emanating the gender aspect of migration. Now, in terms of data generation, again, I have put it as a part of the migration. There are two typical measures in terms of migration, how to collect migration data. One is the migration stock, and the other is the migration flow data. As the name suggests, stock is a count of persons at a given time point who reside in a usual country of residence that's different from a country of birth. Now, this is easier to collect because if you have a sample survey where people go out to ask, were you born in this country or which country were you born in, it's easier to collect this data. Whereas flows are the population over that have changed their country of usual residence. That flow collection of data is usually difficult. Stock data are easier to collect than migration flow data. And more often than not, in this flux, the data on sex or gender was just not collected. In fact, it was not focused upon. They were typically looking at in terms of pure numbers. And let's look at how the trends and patterns have changed, sex-specific migration trends and patterns. So during the 19th and earlier 20th century, international migrants were largely composed of economic migrants and economic and colonial settlers, and hence a relatively balanced sex composition. However, between 1840 and 1920, it's the Industrial Revolution, further time, the global and the colonization time. The global labor migrant population became more male-dominated, demanded temporary male workers to build infrastructure. So, for example, if you remember the World Cup, which is just finished last year in the Gulf in Qatar, required a lot of male workers coming into Qatar to build that infrastructure. So if a survey was happening at that moment of time, you will see the males would outstrip the women by, multiple times. Now, during the 20s, an increased regulation of immigration in many countries pushed global migration towards against a balanced sex distribution of migrant population. I assume the fact that the state or the governments were thinking in the sense that once you have a family migrating, the families are much more stable units rather than individual males who might then create other problems. National laws increasingly restricted male-dominated labor migration, and women and families became a larger share of immigration. I guess that most modern states were looking at families being a more stable unit rather than individuals, and that is how the laws came about. 60 were the first estimate of global migrant population by sex are available for women, and the women comprise about 46.6% of foreign migrants. And academic discourse are talking now about feminization of international migration during economic. In fact, a very interesting way to get a pulse and feel of it is if you if you listen to this in NCR region, there is a radio station 94.3, which is an English radio station, and they have a show on travel. And in fact, in that show on travel, some of the travel bloggers who come are women. And these women travel solo. So no, travel is not a migration, but it gets you a sense of the fact that women are now increasingly looking at movement, at migration, and so on and so forth. Reflected in number of female migrants has also tripled in the past 60 years, rising from 46 million to 135 million in 2020. Has also been accompanied by a large rise in name. In fact, I have a slide, which I think should be next or couple of slides later, which reflects the number of men and women or male and females who are migrating. Let me see if that slide, female and male shares of migrants residing in each destination region between 1990 and 2020, based on the data from UNDESA. UNDESA is the Department of Economic and Social Activities. These are the ones who compile the migrant data. So if you see, the men and women are by far from 1990 to 2020. In fact, world over, the women have decreased slightly and the men have increased slightly from the 50% mark. But that again is skewed, I think, because of the Middle East and North Africa, where males are much higher and females are much lower. Whereas if you see, the rest of the curves are very close by. These are migrants residing in each destination region between 1990 and 2020. It's not from their origin, but where they are residing. And for all those people who might feel that only migration is towards Europe or towards North America, that's not the case. So you see, these are the, on the y-axis is share of immigrants, on the x-axis is the years. And again, as I said, if you send me an email, I can send you the PPT, or Dr. Sahu will send you all the PPTs directly. So all these maps are there. So that's the share of migrants residing in destination regions. Sorry, I hope I didn't move the slide too fast. So even if you see the sub-Saharan Africa, the males and females are very close to the 50% mark.
Hi, sir.
Yeah.
That a lot of variation in Middle East and North Africa, right, compared to remaining graphs.
Yeah. So yeah, Veera, what's the question?
In that pictorial representation in Middle East and North Africa, when compared to remaining pictorial representation, there is a lot of variations there, male and female migrations.
Correct.
All right. Is there any particular reason, sir?
So it's quite possible in the Gulf Cooperation area, Middle East and North Africa. Remember, there is, cultural risks. For example, Saudi Arabia, women can't drive. And in a lot of areas, there might be cultural related, say, for example, I was giving the example of Qatar, where they just had a World Cup, where they were building infrastructure and a lot of male migration was there. So inevitably, and remember, these are migrants residing in each destination. So more often than not, because of a region's particular culture or restrictions or various, other reasons, there are more males than women. So Desh, would you like to pipe in here? You would.
No, sir.
Swadesh, am I right in terms of saying in the Middle East and North Africa, it could be a cultural construct which is leading to more males than females?
Yes, sir. In mostly in Gulf region, the women are restricted. They're not encouraged to move in Gulf countries.
So
People coming to US like countries, European countries, for education and employment in software industries.
So Veera, basically it's the cultural factor. So inevitably, if you remember in the background, we said that it's the, there are multiple factors which get a person to make a decision in terms of migration and where to migrate and how to migrate and which route to take. Veera?
Yeah, understood, sir.
Okay. Comparative growth of female migrants in recent years seen in North American parts is due to a number. So remember, there are migrations happening in North American parts of Europe also. So normally that ideal view that we think that all migration happens to North America or Europe is not the case. So in fact, the migrant population, this region tends to be older. So there were a lot of migrations to these regions much earlier than in other regions. And this is typically based out of that stock flow, migration patterns which have been gleaned out of that stock, mode of finding out migration. The longer lifestyle expectancy tends to increase the relative size of older female migrant groups. So when they are, the national sample survey or something of that happens, and they say your country of origin, they will find more female migrants in the older age group. There are restrictions in Saudi Arabia whereby unless migrants have certain income, they can't bring in their families. Kangat has put in this particular point. So, essentially, that's why I said there might be multiple factors. There is never a single particular factor, otherwise it's called deterministic way. So there would be multiple factors which will either allow or prevent something to happen. And that is the reason why we see more male migrants than female migrants. So in this particular area, because of older population, migrants would come in to take care of it. For example, increasing aging population and change in labor laws, rates of native population led to demand for workers in healthcare. So, for example, Philippines or Filipino women are stepping in to provide healthcare in the Western countries. Also, in wealthier countries across Asia, for example, Hong Kong and China, we will see further in the case study of Philippines, Filipino women are coming to give healthcare. Concentrating jobs regarded as low skilled, such as domestic workers, entertainers, hostesses, restaurant and hotel staff, assembly line workers in clothing and electronics. So that also makes migration happens. So these are sex-specific migration trends and patterns. So any particular thing in a particular country will lead to, a migration inside or a migration outside. So this is how the Western countries migration is happening. Immigrant population in Middle East and North Africa have been predominantly male since 1990. Past year driven by the demand for countries in the GCC for labor in industries such as oil and gas. So that's one of the major reasons, which is being pushing up the male migration and preventing the female migration. This demand outpaced demand for female migrants in the same country in other areas such as domestic work. Now, the interesting part is that irrespective of this male migration rising and the female migration being prevented, the female migration workforce in this country make up for about 46.8% of all female workers in Arab states. So obviously females are going as as migrants, as female workers, but there is a wide difference. In North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, excess number of male migrants are the results of move within the continent where men have traditionally migrated alone to pursue employment opportunities. What is typically happening if you see in India, in a state like Uttarakhand, where men are moving out? So a lot of states, if you see an intra-country migration, you will see there is a lot of male migration from villages into cities, which is purely an economic driven migration. And similarly, that happens, that thing plays out on the international arena. People always migrate towards an economic better opportunity. In a lot of places, it's the males who migrate and then repatriate, send money back home, and then they move back and forth. And in a lot of cases, now the women are migrating or the families migrate. The trend has been tempered by the increased willingness for females in Africa to migrate for work or study, and larger female African refugee population. Remember, Africa is also very active wars which are happening, or active conflicts which are happening, which makes people have no choice but to forcefully move. And in all this, you will also see that there are multiple sources of data. So there's an ILO, there's a Mixed Migration Center, there is the UN DESA. We will see there are various sources. Now, the rise in females abroad can have substantial impacts on family dynamics and communities in places of origin. One of the reasons why males migrate is because then the families do not get disturbed. But now with females migrating, there is going to be an impact on family dynamics. For example, female migrants from Southeast Asia working as domestic workers in developed countries often are abroad for extended periods, children left behind, cared for by grandparents. This is something of a similar thing what we see in Indian villages, where today both husband and wife are going abroad. In fact, in Gurgaon, I come across a lot of these homeless people who are workers, who basically the children are being taken care by the grandparents. Yes, Swadesh, we had talked last time about issues they face when they return home. You had brought it out as though when these people come back home, they are not accepted, or they are not able to, relate with the home situation, and then they go back. Isn't it, Swadesh?
Yeah, sir. After they coming back to the home, some people will blame them what she done in their destinations, and they not care about the children and family members. Sometimes they're not sending remittances to village or the families. She can sometimes they will restricted from that family. Yeah, it will happen. Sometimes they abuse them also.
So you see, migration leads to other consequences.
Yes.
So inevitably, when nations are looking at migrations, there is a governance issue. How do you look at migration? How do you plan for migration? And one of the simplest thing is, unless you have this data, you are never able to then govern. You would not know what's happening. Data becomes a very important task. So females for countries such as Philippines and Indonesia make up some of the most female-dominated migrant corridors in the world. Migrant population in Hong Kong, Singapore, and United Arab. Long history of nurses from Philippines moving to US, where female migration population is one of the largest in the world. Now, these are very unique situations. There are opportunities, and then there are situations. And inevitably, wherever there is a demand, a supply will happen. So one needs to keep digging onto this data, trying to figure out why it's happening, and then take up measures to make sure that gender specific data is available, and then policies are made accordingly. In fact, the Philippines gives a very interesting example, which we have as a case study at the end. Now, for example, most of the time when we look at, we typically think migration is from the south to the global south to the global north. That's not the case. The female Canadian migration population in the US has built over a long history and consistently outnumbered the Canadian male migrant population. So, in fact, in the last unit that we were talking about, there was this case study of this Chinese woman, Chinese girl whose parents first migrated to Canada, then the father migrated to the US, and then she went from China to Canada to US. Now she's an American citizen, but there is no sense of belonging to America. So with migration comes a whole lot of other issues. Yes, women trafficking, then Swadesh becomes, in fact, as we go along, we will see that is one of the reasons why it becomes a double trouble for the female gender, because of trafficking, because of gender related violence and abuse. Gender
Yes,
and
Hyderabad to some Gulf countries, they call girls like a beautician something. I went to there after they go in destinations. They're facing a lot of problems with the owners.
Correct. In fact, recently there was this case of Punjab, where there were all these women who were taken by these agents to Dubai and other places, ostensibly to give them a job, but they were later, put out in all these kind of, as sex slaves or other places. So, in fact, I have that news item in one of the slides later. So it's a well-established fact that the person's sex and gender shape almost all stages and categories of migration, including voluntary and forced. Hence, understanding dimensions associated with complex interplay of gender and migration is essential to formulate effective policies. See, inevitably, as I said, it's a question of governance. Each government or each state would want the people residing within their boundaries to to be able to manage them and to be able to provide them with amenities. Because if they are not able to do that, then there are other social issues, structural inequalities, and structural inequalities always will lead to society strains and issues. So there is an international organization for migration. The roles and expectation, relationships and power dynamics associated with being a man, women, boy or girl significantly affects all aspects of migration process, and can also be affected in new ways by migration. So remember, we also talked about identity politics. So migration, for example, in India, when migration happened from Bangladesh to Assam, it led to, an Assam agitation. Then it led to a whole lot of other things. So, all these things come about. So let's look a little bit at gender and inequalities. Challenges faced by women migrant workers in global south can be different from global north due to different socio-economic and political administrative conditions. However, gender inequalities can be observed cutting across countries. So more often than not, there is we see a lot of places, and it's not a India specific issue or a global south specific issue, as UN reports on gender mainstreaming talks about. So in fact, the UN report provides the following pointers. Hundreds of women migration in deportation centers. So Swadesh has seen in Kuwait, hundreds of women migrate So inevitably, there would be some compulsion for all these women to be migrating. There would be some reason why they are there, and then they are in deportation centers. We have seen we have seen how US is cracking down on migrants. In India, there is this major discourse about migrants. So all these things are happening parallelly. So the UN report on gender mainstreaming provides the following pointers in terms of gender inequalities. Inequalities in political power, underrepresentation of women, inequalities within household, inequalities at the decision-making level. A very interesting thing we saw in terms of news items when India went through the demonetization in 2016. There was a very peculiar situation which happened because a lot of women, especially in the rural areas and even in the urban areas, because being non-financially independent, was saving money. And when the demonetization happened, all that money that they saved perforce had to be brought out. Now, because they were not economically independent or mobile, they had to get this money to their husbands or their the male person in the household, which led to a lot of household tensions. There is an inequality in decision making level, access to resources, and which leads to abuse. Then, of course, there is difference in legal status and entitlement. And again, remember, this happens both in global north and global south. It's not a global south phenomena or a poor country phenomena. It happens across. Then, of course, there is gender division of labor within economy, inequalities in the domestic and unpaid sector. If you would have read the news item, it's only now that International Cricket Organization has talked about that men and women cricketers will now get equal salaries, which is very strange in the 21st century. Uh, um, uh, uh, Women have less access than men to productive assets like education, skill, property, credit. We have seen that in terms of food, in terms of nutrition, in terms of caring, men or males have an advantage. Violence against women, gender-based violence has been witnessed in various forms: domestic violence, ethnic cleansing used as a weapon by the enemy army. In all conflicts, gender violence, violence against women is used as a weapon. Discriminatory attitudes, gender stereotyping, people's ideas and behavior, which often attempts to restrict the independence and aptitude of women. This is generically across the global north and global south. Now, all these, the basic start to any, course correction or any understanding starts with some amount of data. At the global level, we were talking about almost 50% of migrants are women. Nearly half of the world's international migrants are women and girls. Imperative to understand the gender dimensions of migration through a historical perspective. Unless we understand and unless this data is collected and the data is accurate, more often than not, you do not know the level of problems. So, for example, international migrant stock data from the year 1990 to 2020. And this is the UN DESA Population Division 2020. And if you see the migrants, the total migration is constantly increasing. 280 million in 2020, out of which 145 million is male and 134 million is females. So somewhere down the line, we are going through a cyclical process that origin of human beings started with migration, and we are now with globalization continuously increasing in migration. And if you see, I had another slide which I deleted about a 2020. So let's look at some of the gendered causes and impacts of migration. Gendered causes of migration include income generation, family reunification. So, for example, the Canada-US migration is because of family reunification, where males are first traveling to the US for work or other reasons, and then the females join them. Gender discrimination and norms is an impact. Trafficking is an impact. Conflict and persecution is an impact. Impacts on migrants themselves, migration and gender relation. What is happening when this migration is happening? So when Filipino women are migrating, what is happening to the relationship between the Filipino men and Filipino women? Challenging traditional gender roles. So, and this is the same thing what we see is in terms of internal migration. When we look at India and we look at the internal migration because of migration of men in, let's say, a state like Uttarakhand. I was just reading a story on Uttarakhand migration where villages upon villages have become empty because people have migrated. It started off with men and then women. Entrenching traditional gender role, contradictory effects of migration, gendered effects of changing to a more settled life. So what there are, it inevitably not only affects the migrants, it also affects the places where they reside. There is a change of culture. So for example, in Haryana, there was this very interesting case study in the Jat heartland because of the decrease of because in the 90s and 2000s when the sex selective abortion started happening, the sex ratio decreased, and subsequently there were more males than females. And then in Haryana they started marrying girls from Kerala or from Northeast. A certain amount of women were trafficked into Haryana for marriage, which has led to a change in culture in in the Jatland. The Jat community is sensing a change of culture because, and then inevitably when a girl comes from a particular place, she gets other friends to marry into those families, which has an impact. A research study on social capital and refugee integration in UK finds that women refugees fared less well in terms of emotional and physical health than their male counterparts. So anytime we tend to look at male and female in a common brushstroke is where the mistakes happen. Because psychologically, physically, physiologically, male and women are different. Male and females are different. Social capital is in this study meant education, health, employment, housing, social connection, language, cultural knowledge. And all these things lead to what we had defined in some of the previous units as belonging. So in the absence of a belonging, the emotional and physical health suffers. So, and then the global synthetic data set produced by counter trafficking data collaborations revealed that from 2002 to 21, the women trafficking, what Swadesh was talking about, it clearly shows women have been more vulnerable and prone to tracking due to various reasons. And in fact, I had this was the news item of Punjab. This is a latest case where women from Punjab sold to locals in Oman, Dubai, Muscat. And these women were ostensibly taken for lucrative jobs offerings. What Swadesh was talking about in Andhra, from Andhra. So women become much more, prone to trafficking. Women and children become much more prone to trafficking than males. COVID-19, for example, had an impact on women migrant workers. From an IOM analytical snapshot, US immigrant women face the highest unemployment rate of 18.5%. Survey done by Carleton University reveals immigrant women in Canada had been adversely affected. Women across the spectrum had been adversely impacted because of COVID-19. Similarly, Central Eastern Europe, migrants from Central and Eastern Europe were affected in Norway, indicated many women migrant workers got isolated or trapped with abusers, which was I was talking about. In terms of once the COVID happened, they were trapped with their abusers in workplaces or homes because of pandemic-induced restrictions. Now, ILO, International Labour Organization, has a gender equality provisions. ILO works in terms of to promote decent and productive work for women and men in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. ILO has various conventions for equality and decent work report. So these are the conventions. Equal remuneration for men and women, discrimination in respect of employment, freedom of association, minimum age, prohibition and elimination of worst forms of child labor. So ILO keeps working in terms of labor. Now, gender migration, data collection itself has its challenges. Data associated with migration is essential to understand the complexities. Evidence-based policy. So unless you have data, you will not be able to formulate evidence-based policies. When we make a political statement that we are besieged by migrants from Bangladesh, what is the data? How do and then what are the policies? What is the, because in the absence of, for example, India does not have has not signed the refugee convention. Similarly, when states are looking at making policies, what is the migrate, the data becomes important, and that data, unless has a gender component, can hinder the possibility to achieve effective global migration governance. See, at the end of the day, it's a governance issue. Absence of data creates a governance issues. There is a small variety of collections of sex-specific migration flow data. Migration stock data is easier to compute. A number of migration flow data estimates and collection, including they are doing estimates without breakdown by sex. Obviously, migration flow data collection is that much more difficult. So breakdown by sex becomes all the more difficult. However, this data needs to be collected. And in fact, the most complete data set on global migrant stock is published by UNDESA. So if you Google search on UNDESA, you will find a lot of data which they bring out. In fact, a lot of data is available. Then International Labour Organization produces an estimate of global migrant labor population based on an estimation method to combine total migrant stock data from UNDESA with labor force participation rates. So UNDESA and ILO provides various data. There are 5 significant gaps and challenges in migration data: production and collection of inclusive sex and gender disaggregated data. So if there are multiple gender categories, we cannot, when we are collecting data, and inevitably the data collector needs to understand the multiple gender categories to collect the data. More often than not, in fact, the collection worker might also not be aware of the multiple categories, so might put it under the broad heads of male and female. Gaps in data on the intersectional experience of women and people with diverse gender identities. As I said today, there are diverse gender identities. So for example, a very interesting thing, in a lot of forms on school education, they tend to ask the father's name. Today, with a lot of single parent families, it becomes very difficult. In fact, on social media, I see many times single women parents complaining why. So obviously, when you're talking about governance, you're talking about policies, you're talking about inclusiveness, all these things come into picture. Then inconsistencies in types and frequencies of measurement. How often the measurement is happening? Is there an inconsistency? Obviously, there's a lack of capacity in National Statistical Office and data systems. Inevitably, these are government. Government has a bureaucracy. It takes time for things to happen. And then challenges in relation to transparency, accountability, and ethics in migration data. There are obviously, you need trained researchers or trained people to collect this data. Biases then affect the ethics, accountability, and transparency. So these are 5 significant gaps. So let's look at this case study of Philippines. In fact, the government has played an instrumental role in facilitating the immigration and creating demand for Filipino women migrant workers, especially in the care work sector. What typically, for example, today we look at the nurses from Kerala. Across the country, we look at nurses from Kerala. In Philippines, there's a pre-departure orientation seminar by the government which reinforced the traditional notion of nurturing associated with migrant women. So actually the government, facilitates the movement of these migrant women. Then they are improving their data management through various agencies like the Department of Labor Employment. There is something called the Philippines Overseas Employment Administration and Overseas Worker Welfare Administration. So they have this. And according to 2019 survey, there are approximately 2.2 million overseas Filipino workers. Overseas Filipino workers females account for 56%, much higher than male, 7% in 15. So they have this breakup of data with this and the preferred destinations, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Kuwait, and Qatar. Once you have this kind of data, then you are able to, your governance becomes much more effective. The main occupational categories for Philippine women migrant workers include jobs as domestic workers, nurses. There are something also called marriage migrants. Then there are something called au pairs. Free boarding and lodging, pocket money, and time off to attend language courses, and return they're expected to help with childcare and share light household work. They have categorized that. More women are engaged in lower and unskilled occupation, domestic workers. Filipino men migrants primarily engage in trade and machinery and categorized as production workers. Financial contribution, women migrant workers also known for sharing values and ideas. Activism and leadership, caregiving for domestic workers identify as a tutor and constant companion. So there are multiple ways this women overseas workers are contributing. Okay, let's sum up. Complex interrelationship between gender and migration, reference to history and demographic. There are challenges associated with gender migration data across the globe. ILO had developed crucial provisions for gender equality over time. And we have looked at case study of Philippines with specific reference to its migration governance mechanism. And then, of course, there are some of these references in your study material. There will be more. There is Birchall, there is CTDC, Global Synthetic Data Set. Then there is a policy paper, Philippines, on Philippines, Gender and Migration Data, Guide for Evidence-Based Gender Migration Data. Swadesh, absolutely. In fact, hang on, let me just stop this. Swadesh, in fact, rehabilitation and reintegration also would be a part of the governance. But then you would have to look at, do we have the data as to how many people are coming back? What are the kind of issues that, see, at the end of the day, research, that is why research, academic research and scholarship becomes a very important issue in just about every field. And diaspora, migration, gender issues. That is why, are we doing enough research to figure out what is the state, what is required, what are the gaps? Unless we do that, it will always be an issue. Swadesh?
Yes, sir. Yeah, you are rightly pointed out. This is a role majorly from the by the government. The
So,
government need to take steps to.
so inevitably, then there is another issue which comes in. More often than not, government is always short on resources, and that's where think tanks, NGOs, non-government organizations, is what is NGOs, etc., come into being. Now, in the absence of all these think tanks, universities, NGOs, and if there is not going to be a conducive relationship between the government and the non-government, more often than not, all these issues will not be looked at. And there are complex issues today in terms of governance, in terms of statecraft, and then migration and diaspora brings a whole new challenge. Swadesh?
Yes, sir, it's a big challenge. Is there any institutions or universities are encouraging submitted research on this rehabilitation and reintegration?
So inevitably, I suppose migration and diasporas would typically get categorized under under the interdisciplinary field. I think in India also now more and more, some of my video is not functioning. Okay, sorry, my video is not functioning. So for example, what this course IGNOU is offering, I think is a landmark course in terms of, and then there was another student last time who was doing his PhD from JNU in this particular field in terms of diaspora in Africa. See, again, as a country of size of India with this kind of diversity and the kind of migration, that there is a lot more which is required to be done to be able to understand the various dimensions of migration and diaspora. And then to have a gendered view becomes a bigger challenge. Swadesh?
Yes, sir, you're right. Yeah.
Any other
There
question?
are many stages in migration. That's why it's a multidisciplinary subject.
Correct.
That's why you're saying a lot of institutions and trade unions, NGOs, INGOs, IOM, ILO, they're all work together.
And the worst part happens with the academic system is we are still working with in silos. So the anthropology department only works in anthropology, the history department works in history, and in fact today the modern state or the modern challenges of the world is an interdisciplinary world, where if we have seen over the last few courses, we have brought in history, we brought in anthropology, we brought in sociology, psychology. There are all kinds of interdisciplinary way we have to look at migration and diaspora, and gender then comes under women's studies. So, unless those silos get broken in an academic field, more often than not, our universities will just not rise up to the challenge of looking at all these things in a multidisciplinary field. Swadesh?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other question?
Yeah.
From my side.
Okay, my video.
So this is Bhamishra. I just wanted to know one thing. How are the universities as of now linked with the policy making of the government? Is the Overseas Development Department of India or any other countries interacting to take up some specified research programs, or even to understand the needs of various communities parts of India?
Abha, we have a issue or a major gap between the university and policy making and the university and industry kind of linkages. We have major gaps out there. So, in fact, if you see in the West, there is a lot of linkages. I was being told that in certain universities in the West and other places, the professors are also supposed to go and work in the industries to get an understanding. We still have those gaps out here. We are still working in the academics works in a lot of academic vacuum. So
Is the ministry thinking of anything of that sort? I mean, Niti Aayog is there. What is the role Niti Aayog is trying to play specifically in this? Because, as a young country where we will see more and more migration happening, I think so, most likely. With the aging population in most of the developed world, so-called developed world, how is the ministry thinking of doing something? And I'll tell you why I'm asking this question. Of course, I'm working with the UNDP, so it would be an interesting take a concept to them to start something which they may be interested, not be interested, but would help our country and specifically the migrants in a long way.
I am not aware, Abha, I'm actually not aware whether, these kind of linkages are happening. More often than not, what I see is, for example, a very interesting thing. There is a digital data protection law, which is now being going to be presented in the parliament. I have not seen it being actively debated in the academic circles or in the universities, and something come about out of which papers are brought out and then taken to Niti. There is still a lot of gaps between these kind of things. So I am not at least in the public domain there is nothing which shows that there is an active linkages. Abha?
Right, sir. Thank you. So maybe, I mean, listening to you specifically because gender is one of the sustainable development goals. Which
Absolutely.
So this specifically, and this interests me also, something we could start and discuss and see how it, I mean.
So in fact, so Abha, Kangat Ranjit is writing on ground. It's difficult. He's from the paramilitary force. It is difficult to sort out issues when human trafficking victim is located, as it involves various agencies. MH is working on reducing migration in Indian border. So more often than not, the migration by various states, and it's not just the Indian state, various states look at migration from the issue of a security lens. Now, when you start looking at things from a security lens, the way to look at things changes. And again, today, the modern, world system is much more complex than what it was many times back. And then that is where there is a very active need for more academic research, some scholarship onto various issues, which then gets plugged into policy, in the absence of which, inevitably everything becomes ad hoc. And we have seen, ad hocism is like typically trying to plug a breach one place, and then you will see, there is an active problem somewhere else. So that is the reason why policies become important, because policies allow you to guide in a particular direction. We have, as I said, we still haven't signed the refugee convention, so we do not know how to handle our refugees. So in the absence of that, we tend to look at it from a security lens. And again, people on the ground, then, an operational person on the ground, in the absence of a policy, does not know how decisions have to be taken, and then it becomes an ad hocism. Abha?
Right, sir. But one thing is then, sir, there is a difference between a refugee and a migration. I mean, in migration, which could be, how do you say, self-driven, motivated, and
Okay.
of course, there could be some of them as trafficked.
Okay.
So there are these three different parameters within the migration also, if we want to say it so.
Correct. But
And
again,
we can't overlap it because the issues would be quite different for
quite
each of
different.
the.
You're absolutely right. But then that is where we have to, namely come out with a policy as to what is that we are looking at, and how do we treat, and what are the opportunities. So, for example, we have a Tibetan policy, as I was explaining. We have a Tibetan policy now in place where Tibetans are supposed to get the government benefits, and yet Tibetans are leaving India to go to the West in the absence of opportunities. So it becomes pretty complex that way, because we have, then there is this thing about the local politics which comes into play, because there are local opportunities also. People are looking at opportunities, and then you have the migrant population also looking at opportunities, and then the identity politics comes into the thing.
Right, sir.
Abha, if UNDP is interested in doing a project on Indo-Nepal border, let me know. So Kangat is writing on the chat, Abha.
You're right, sir. I will let you know, sir, if there is any scope, because that's basically the IOM, which does a lot of work on this.
Correct. So you'll see UNDP also is structured in a particular bureaucratic way in terms of how projects are run, how they will go about. There are some, there is some goals, then yearly projection or whatever it is. So
yeah.
Okay, so you can exchange emails and figure it out. Any other question?
Sure.
Any other question?
Hi, sir. This is Veera.
Hi, Veera.
I have one. Most of the problem, the migration is happening in between global north to global south, as well as global south to global north. But most of the problem or issues are there while global south to global north. Is it correct, sir? Yes, right.
Oh, that is because there is a lot of press which is coming out about south to north migration. And in fact, it becomes ironical. For example, we have seen a lot of press stories about, the migration to US, and then the earlier president wanting to build a wall to stop in migrant. So, this is this obviously is going to be a problem which will not get solved easily, because for a simple reason, states are now trying to stop migration. But the fact, see, for example, the UK wanting to send migrants to Rwanda, and then people question the fact that UK was, or Britain was, responsible for a large migrant community across the world during colonization, and now you want to stop migration to UK, which is kind of weird. So world over, this conflict will happen. Remember, our news stories are still predominantly West generated, or Western countries, or global North generated. So we tend to get a lot of, so for example, floods are happening in Haryana, Punjab, Himachal, UP, but the largest news is coming out of Delhi. So that will happen, that skewedness of the way news stories play out. So for example, it almost might make you feel that people are migrating en masse from south to north, which is not the case. But then the fact is, it's the global north which created a lot of problems with colonization. So, sorry.
In this context, most of these international governing organizations, like as in today's class we discussed, UNDP or
DESA and
International
ILO.
Organization of Migration and International Labor Organization, all these things, they are a little bit of biased to global north, right, sir? To making the policies related to, but
see, inevitably, we need to understand there will be a certain amount, there might be a certain amount of bias. I won't say that's totally biased or everybody is biased. There might be a certain amount of bias. See, remember, we all operate in cultures, and culture makes us biased towards our particular culture. And that is the reason why unless substantive data or substantive policies or substantive academic research happens, let's say in India or global south, we'll always be dependent on the north. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, 21st century is a knowledge economy, it's an information economy. We, for example, in India, over the last few years, we have been trying to hide data or not produce enough high quality data, which is in the public domain. Now, what would typically happen is then if you are not going to push your data out, which is high quality data, somebody else is going to push their data onto you. Hira?
Yeah, understood.
So, remember today it's an active geopolitical competition between south, north, between various states, and each state will be known in terms of how you are operating on a global platform. So, academic scholarship in terms of research, in terms of data, unless we do that and push in terms of these forums, we'll inevitably kind of get swamped by the kind of information and data which is produced by the Western countries or the global north.
Like this case study is there, right? Philippines case study, that is a very beautiful, right? We can, that means if I don't know, but if it is possible, we can adopt that one. That means pre-departure orientation seminars.
Correct, absolutely. But Veera, you need to understand one thing. India is so many multiple times larger than Philippines, and it is extremely complex and diverse. So, for a smaller country like, for example, Nepal, Bhutan, Philippines, these are smaller countries. Singapore, extremely small country. We will have 10,000 times Singapore of Delhi. So when we, try and work, so India can only create India-specific solutions. We can see the various case studies, and yet we will need to find out some specific solutions which work in India, because it's a huge and a diverse country, and the problems become that much more manifold than what we look at smaller countries. They are much more slightly homogeneous in a particular way. Our diversity is both an advantage and a disadvantage. Veera?
Yes, sir.
Kangat, you are absolutely right. International policies, that's because we are not pushing enough. We are not bringing out enough research. There are not enough scholars of ours who are presenting papers, pushing out, bringing new aspects. So inevitably, the West is, pushing out their data and stuff. Okay. Any other question? Or we are already, we've crossed our time. Any questions?
Last question, sir, regarding the sports related thing. Assignment, sir. I have enrolled for January 2023. Assignment submission last date, all these things, where I can find.
Veera, for any course related stuff or assignment related stuff, you have to ask Dr. Sadanand Sahu. I'm more as a resource person in terms of talking to you. Or talking about the course material, about the administration and the logistics, you would need to ask Dr. Sahu.
Okay. Second thing, sir. For example, one topic is there. We want to create one research paper. How to create it? Can you explain? Not now, in next class also.
Yeah,
No
matlab,
problem.
what do you mean by how to create a research paper?
Want to I have one curious. Regularly we have to read one newspaper, so we can find one topic. Want
Ah,
to invest and create one research paper. Can you give me a little bit of suggestions on how to write a research paper, how to publish, where to publish? I don't know.
oh, okay, okay. So, Veena, there are multiple journals. So you can write a research paper. Your research paper can be published. Let's say Economic and Political Weekly (EPW) can also they also publish it. But there are a lot of journals. You can look at journals which would there are multiple journals which would submit. First, why don't you do this? Why don't you look at what topic you would like to publish a research paper in? You can also do a little Google search on the feel and look and format of a research paper. You could have a research paper in, let's say, 5,000 words, 5 to 7,000 words. You could look at a topic. Research paper has a format which starts with an abstract. There are keywords, there's an introduction, there is a body, and there's a conclusion. And you can offline ask Dr. Sahu, you can ask me. Once you have a topic, you can start writing. You can do a little Google search, look at a couple of research papers. There is a website called ResearchGate or academic.edu on which a lot of research papers are published. You can download a couple of research papers and look at them. And I think you should definitely give it a try. I am so much for every person trying to look at and writing a research paper. That way you also feel good in trying to be able to articulate your thoughts, to be able to look at things in a different point of view, and to be able to get something published. Veera?
Yeah, sir. I will send the
Anytime you
topic.
need any help, we are always there.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay. Okay. So have a wonderful weekend. I will meet you whenever I next meet you then. Bye-bye then.